Today we're going to talk about storing up treasures in heaven. In Matthew 6:19, Jesus makes an interesting statement. Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth." Now, what we're going to find out is this was not really teaching us not to give it all, not to give away everything, or for that matter, even most of our stuff. Doesn't want us to do that. This is about the source that we seek for real spiritual happiness that lasts forever, as opposed to earthly things that are extremely temporary. You know, maybe you've heard this expression, and it's a pretty popular one, right? It says, money can't buy happiness. I might argue that. I'm going to have to disagree with that one. In fact, I'd say just go down and ask a homeless person, say, would you be happier if you had a nice warm place to live with running water and AC and a vehicle to get you around? Would that make you happier? Maybe ask someone who owns a nice home and has many nice things if his or her happiness would be impacted if suddenly it all went away. So yeah, it does bring us happiness, but that's a temporary kind of happiness. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying as I go through this. Again, those things, they are all temporary. None of them bring us the deeper, more meaningful joy that we discover lasts forever as we seek spiritual things first. But in Matthew 6:19, when Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, and this is oftentimes taught as, by the way, as this command not to invest too much money into your retirement plans. Maybe you need to avoid buying a fancy car. Maybe you need to avoid buying a TV or bigger homes. And it doesn't in there. This also is commonly taught as a command to give that money instead of on those things that you need to be giving most of it to the church, mission trips, and to the needy. It seems people just want to guilt trip us into giving everything that we earn away. And there's only one problem. That's really not God's heart. That's not what he wants, and that's not what he expects from any of us. Now, I know, again, some might argue it's all God's anyway. And I want to say duh to that. Duh, that is the stupidest thing that people throw at us. No one is arguing that everything is God's. Matter of fact, whatever I have, God gave it to me. God gave it to me. And if he can give it to me, this much I'm sure of, he can give it to somebody else. I'm not going to put him in a box and say, well, God can only, the other people can only get out of their situation if I'm willing to get out of my box and do it. And again, I can't be clear enough. This is not a teaching of don't help the poor. This is not a teaching of don't help the needy. I am so far against that kind of teaching, it's not even funny. You're darn right we need to give from our abundance, and we need to help those that absolutely need it. And I support that, and I will defend that to the end. So again, there's always that one, and we always get those comments from somebody in the thread that like they don't hear anything we say. They just hear one line, they throw the rest away, and then they hurl their bad comments. So just want to make that point clear. So before you jump to any conclusions, yes, I believe we are called to give where there is a need. We are certainly called to give from the heart. We're called to give from our abundance. And I do believe it's our biblical responsibility to help those that are poor and unable to work. Keyword, unable, not unwilling. Side note, I do want to say this. There is no biblical truth, no scriptural requirement, no commands from God that we should have a government take our money and give it away for us. That's our responsibility, and it's ours alone. So even if a bunch of people want to get together and vote for it, to take it from people that go to work every day and take it out of their taxes and redistribute it, taking someone else's money, even if it's by popular vote, to give it away, if you're taking it against their will, theft is still theft, even if you legalize it. So, well, I digress. So let's continue to move on. I always like to point that out. My point here is too many people are trying to reframe what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 6. So let's just read the verses real quick. They say, it's Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 to 21. He says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where the moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. A couple things I want to point out. Abraham was pretty rich. Actually, by all standards, Abraham was exceedingly rich. King David was exceedingly rich. Look, throughout the Bible, we see that there were many people after God's own heart that were wealthy, right? God has never said it was evil to be well off. And he never said you had to give it all away. And as far as I'm concerned, if anyone believes that we're called to give away or all of our stuff or most of it, then you would be the hypocrite, a hypocrite of the absolute worst kind. If you have a home, you got a nice car, let's go further. If you've got a TV, you don't need a TV, do you? A cell phone, jewelry, or whatever. It makes you a hypocrite beyond measure. Now, some people may quote the story about the rich young ruler and how it was easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle. And as always, I want to say this, context is everything. We've got a separate video on that, but the bottom line, the short version is, that was talking about trying to get right with God through law, and that it would be easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it would for you to get right with God through human effort. But again, that's another video. Just want to point that out. So, what we should learn from this message, or what should we learn about this message that Jesus has given on the Mount, this sermon here, right? What did Jesus mean by do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth? Well, I think it's fairly simple. Here's what I think Jesus is teaching us. Look at what he said immediately after saying don't store up treasures on earth. What he didn't say was, he didn't say anything about, so go give it all away. No, that would be like we're writing some kind of heavenly check, right? We just write in this head, as long as I give it away, it's sort of a heavenly check for treasures in the kingdom. You see, really this verse here, it's about you and where you will really find fulfillment that lasts. When we do things like love others and we exude the love of Christ, that's a way of storing up spiritual treasures, if you will. What I'm saying is this. Jesus is not talking about, the message isn't go and give all your stuff away. He's talking about an attitude, right? An inward attitude that comes from us, that fulfills us permanently, right? He's talking about walking in the Spirit. You having nice stuff in no way means that you're not able to store up treasures in heaven. But I'm saying boats and cars, they're temporary, right? They just rust and they rot. Money, cell phones, TVs, they're all temporary. They can all be stolen. They can all be destroyed in an instant and be gone. All of these things bring us pleasure, but it's temporary earthly pleasure. But none of these things should ever be our source for real happiness, real deep meaning, spiritual happiness that can't be corrupted. It can't be taken away. In other words, when we seek the things of God first, now don't let someone twist that, or you're saying you got to give it all away. That's not seeking the things of God first. It may look like that sometimes. We may give some away. We may give a lot away. That's between you and God. But when we seek the things of God first, that's when we have peace. It's when we have joy and we have happiness and things that last in eternity, right? We're storing up these things in heaven, the things we're doing right now that never last. Simply put, you can't bring a boat with you in heaven. You can't bring a car. You can't bring your money. Those things don't last. And God is saying, hey, you know what will last? Love, kindness, peace, joy, gentleness, like letting Christ live through us. We are so fulfilled, and it's just true. We can be happy in our boat. I know I can be happy riding around in a new nice car, but nothing will ever fulfill. We have new hearts and new desires, and God's Spirit living in us. Nothing will ever fulfill us the way letting Christ live in and through us does. We are programmed. We are wired for good works. It is a natural thing. And that's what really Jesus, I believe, is teaching us. All the other stuff, icing on the cake. Now, you may have a great job today, and that job might afford you to have all kinds of fancy clothes. You may be able to go out and eat some nice meals, and maybe even a whole lot more. And there's nothing wrong with that. I want to be clear. There's nothing inherently wrong with having nice things and having a lot of money. Don't let someone guilt you into feeling like greedy and unacceptable to God because you've done well for yourself. If you've stolen it, yeah, that's different. If you've taken possession of these things illegally or immorally for that matter, then yeah, that's a whole different story. We're not talking about that. We're talking about someone who went to school, learned a lot, got a good education, makes a good income, has managed his money well, didn't go into crazy debt, and he has nice things, whatever. Enjoy it. But all of that could be gone tomorrow. And if we don't understand the real source of where joy comes from, we are looking in the wrong place. And when all that other stuff, if you will, is gone, we won't know what to do. Our hearts need something deeper and something that lasts when the physical, earthly stuff is no longer here. I want to close with something the Apostle Paul said. I think this fits perfectly with what Jesus is teaching us in Matthew 6. At times, Paul was doing, he's doing pretty darn good, we're going to find. And he even says he has plenty. At times, we see that Paul's very well fed. He said he was living in plenty. To me, if I am living in plenty, in today's times, probably got a nice car, very nice house, nice family, maybe some nice furniture. Doesn't mean I'm rich, but I'm certainly not struggling. At times, he said he was well fed. He was living in plenty. And Paul also said there were other times when he was in need. He said he was hungry and that he lived in want. Now, if you're living in want, what does that tell you? If I'm living in want, I need things. I have nothing. I'm struggling. I can guarantee everyone listening to this, I can guarantee that Paul would prefer to be living in plenty and well-fed than the opposite, right? But Paul's source for happiness, we're going to find, was Jesus, right? And because Jesus was the source, and that's where Paul stored up his treasures, Paul was able to be content, even at times when he had little. And that's what we're supposed to be learning. That was the secret. But don't make the mistake of thinking somehow that Paul would choose to struggle. Yes, Paul was willing to struggle. He was willing to give up his right to have a house, a car. He didn't, of course, have a car, but that would be like you being willing to go without a lot of money, willing to go without a boat, willing to go without plenty of food. But we won't necessarily choose to go without that. And Paul certainly was not choosing. Paul gave up that right, or he was willing to give up that right if it was God's will for whatever reason. And so should we. We should be content with what we have. And for sometimes that looks like a lot, and sometimes it looks like a little. I can say this. I've honestly shared that experience as Paul. I have had very little, very, very, very little, and I've been very well fed and very well blessed. And I can tell you right now, I was willing to have little. I didn't have any choice, but I was still able to find contentment. And when I had much more, I'm still more content. But those earthly things are not my source. So this is really all about a fulfillment, a spiritual fulfillment that lasts forever. That's what we're storing up in heaven. Those are the treasures we're storing up. We are not writing heavenly checks by giving money away. That's not the context. So the verses I wanted to share with you guys, and then we'll wrap it up here, is Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. This is Paul speaking. He says, I have learned to be content And whatever the circumstances, in other words, it doesn't matter, good or bad, guys, I've learned to be content. How? Well, he wants to continue. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every, you get it, with lots of good stuff and nothing at all. In any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Now, of course, I'm sure everyone clearly would realize these verses here about I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. He's not talking about, that verse has been so wildly abused. Paul's simply saying, he's talking about I can get through it all. I can be content. And he's saying not like, I can succeed, you can do it, you can do all things through Christ. He's saying, no. Even when everything's fallen apart, I can be content right there in that moment. Even if it never gets better, I can be content right there in that moment. My secret is Jesus Christ. My secret is not getting more money, getting my bills paid, getting my mortgage paid. No, my secret's Jesus Christ. A lot to take in. I hope some of you found it helpful. God bless y'all.